Officer Nolan, how did your DNA end up on the evidence? The courtroom fell silent as Nolan's face turned pale. The truth unraveled, shocking and damning. But what happened next left everyone in utter disbelief. Jaden Miller's life shattered in a single heartbeat. One moment he was walking home from school, earbuds in, mind drifting toward an upcoming history test. The next, the screech of tires and the cold bark of authority ripped him from his thoughts. The black and white cruiser slid up alongside him, and Officer Eric Nolan stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face carved from stone and ice-blue eyes that seemed to cut through skin. "Hey, you!" Nolan's voice sliced through the afternoon air. Jaden froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Come here." Jaden hesitated, then took a step forward. His mother had always told him to be respectful, not to give them a reason. Nolan's eyes were sharp and predatory as they scanned Jaden's face, his clothes, his backpack. "You match the description of a robbery suspect," Nolan said, his voice low and flat. "What? No, Jaden stammered. "I just left school." But Nolan was already reaching for his cuffs. A hard hand seized Jaden's arm, spinning him toward the wall. His cheek scraped the cold brick as Nolan twisted his arm behind his back. "Stop resisting," Nolan growled. "I'm not—" Jaden barely got the words out before the cuffs bit into his wrists. Panic flooded his chest. He could feel the burn of eyes on him, bystanders frozen on the sidewalk, watching. No one stepped in, no one moved. He was shoved into the back of the cruiser, the door slamming shut behind him. Jaden's breath came shallow and fast as he stared out the window, the familiar streets warping into a nightmare blur. His mind raced. This had to be a mistake. They would figure it out. They had to. At the station, Nolan sat across from him, eyes gleaming with cold amusement. A grainy black and white video flickered on the screen. A figure in a hoodie, face blurred, running from a convenience store. "That's not me," Jaden said, voice trembling. Nolan smiled thinly. "Yeah? Then how do you explain this?" He tossed a small plastic bag onto the table, white powder visible through the clear plastic. Jaden's blood turned to ice. "That's not mine." "It was in your backpack," Nolan said, leaning in close enough for Jaden to smell the faint tang of aftershave beneath his uniform. "Guess you forgot about it." Jaden's mouth went dry. He hadn't touched drugs in his life. He didn't even know what the inside of a convenience store looked like past buying candy. But Nolan's gaze told him it didn't matter. "Please, The door burst open. His mother, Angela, rushed in, her eyes wide with panic. "This is a mistake," she shouted. "My son would never—" "He's going down," Nolan cut in, his smile widening. Angela's hands trembled as she reached for Jaden's arm. "You can't do this." Nolan stood, his shadow swallowing the room. "I already have." Jaden sat in the holding cell that night, hands curled into fists. The cold metal bench beneath him bit into his skin. His heartbeat roared in his ears. He was innocent. But the truth didn't matter. Not here. Not when the system was built to crush him before he could even speak. And as the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, Jaden realized something chilling. Nolan wasn't just doing his job. He was hunting. The trial moved fast. Too fast. It was clear from the start that the system wasn't built to give Jaden a fair shot. Nolan was a decorated officer, his file spotless, his record clean. On paper, he was the model cop. In reality, he was a predator with a badge. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man in his 50s with a cold, surgical tone, wasted no time framing Jaden as a dangerous criminal. The grainy security footage was weak evidence, barely recognizable, but Nolan's testimony was crisp and confident. He told the court how he'd caught Jaden red-handed, how Jaden had supposedly tried to run before Nolan apprehended him. The details were too perfect, too rehearsed, but it didn't matter. The jury was listening. Jaden's public defender, Mark Holloway, sat 2 seats away from him, flipping nervously through his notes. Holloway was young, green, and clearly out of his depth. His questions to Nolan were weak and scattered, easily dismantled by the prosecutor. Nolan sat on the stand with an air of quiet confidence, smirking slightly as Holloway stumbled over his words. Angela sat in the gallery every day, hands tightly clasped in her lap. Her face was a mask of forced composure, but her eyes told the truth: fear, rage, helplessness. She watched as Nolan's lies slithered into the courtroom like poison, twisting the narrative. Every time the prosecutor spoke about Jaden, he painted him not as a teenager but as a threat, a young man with troubled ties who fit the profile of a dangerous offender. It didn't matter that Jaden had no criminal record. It didn't matter that he had a 3.9 GPA, or that he was a star on the debate team. All they saw was the color of his skin. Jaden sat stiffly, hands pressed together in his lap. His eyes swept over the jury, a mostly white panel, and saw the truth written across their faces: suspicion, fear, condemnation. He could feel it in the way they looked at him, like he was already guilty. He'd done nothing wrong, but the system wasn't built for truth. It was built for conviction. After the hearing ended for the day, Angela lingered in the hallway, rubbing her temples. That's when Nolan appeared, his tall frame casting a shadow against the dim courthouse light. His uniform was crisp, the polished badge catching the light. "You really think your boy is going to get out of this?" Nolan's voice was low, dangerous. His smile was thin and sharp. "He's just another punk. Better teach him some respect." Angela's eyes flashed with fury. "You know he didn't do this." Nolan's smile widened. He took a step closer, his cold blue eyes cutting into her. "Doesn't matter. Jury sees a black kid in handcuffs. They've already made up their minds." Angela's hands curled into fists. "I swear to God, if you destroy my son's life—" "You can't touch me," Nolan whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "No one can." Angela's chest heaved as Nolan walked away, his boots echoing down the marble hallway. She stood there, shaking, hands trembling with rage and fear. She knew then, this wasn't just about Jaden. Nolan had done this before, and unless someone stopped him, he would do it again. Angela couldn't let this happen. She hired a private investigator, Lisa Carter, a sharp and relentless woman in her 30s. Lisa dug into Nolan's background, and what she found was explosive. Nolan had a history of misconduct: racial profiling, false arrests, and evidence tampering. Most of it had been quietly buried by the department. Jaden's DNA test was the key. Lisa requested it after noticing discrepancies in the evidence report. The DNA on the bag of drugs didn't match Jaden, but even more shocking, it matched Nolan. During the next court hearing, Jaden's defense attorney handed over the DNA report to the judge. "This can't be right," Nolan said, sweat forming on his forehead. "It's a mistake." "Officer Nolan, how did your DNA end up on the evidence?" the judge asked. I don't know." Lisa stood up. "Your Honor, I have evidence that Officer Nolan has a history of planting evidence and fabricating charges. This is part of a larger pattern of misconduct." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Nolan's lawyer tried to intervene, but it was too late. The judge's face darkened. "Officer Nolan, you are under investigation for evidence tampering, perjury, and misconduct." Jaden's eyes widened. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered in his chest. Nolan's arrest was all over the news. Angela hugged Jaden tightly as the charges against him were dropped. "I told you," she whispered. "We'd get through this." Jaden sat in the courtroom as the verdict against Nolan was read, guilty on all counts. Nolan was stripped of his badge and sentenced to prison, The same cold look Jaden had seen in Nolan's eyes during the arrest was gone. In its place was fear. As Jaden left the courthouse, reporters swarmed him. "How do you feel, Jaden?" one shouted. Jaden smiled slightly. "I feel free." Months later, Jaden sat in his dorm room, accepted into a pre-law program at Howard University. He glanced at the framed photo of his father on the desk. "I'm going to change the system," Jaden whispered. "One case at a time." Angela's voice called from the hallway. "Dinner's ready?" Jaden smiled. He had faced injustice, and won, and it was just the beginning.